All right, we got folks from London, Turkey, Kabul, Niger, Senegal. Welcome. We are going to get started. All right. Hello. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. It's wonderful to see everyone. If you're just joining, feel free to share a little bit about where you're joining in from in the chat, and we'll get started. So, welcome to today's webinar about the Data Management and Security Playbook that Dimagi recently released. We have an incredible lineup of experts here today to share insights, frameworks, and best practices on secure data management. I'm Amy Vaccaro, and I'll be facilitating the conversation. So first, we'll hear about the state of data security in global development from Erin Quinn, Dimagi's Senior Director of Customer Success. Next, I'll invite Dimagi's CTO, Clayton Sims, to speak at a high level on security best practices based on his 20 years of work building secure, scalable applications for global development organizations, most notably CommCare. And speaking of CommCare, we'll then hear from Cowger, who heads up product and technology for CommCare, Dimagi's digital data collection and program delivery platform. Kai will bring some of the best practices shared down to reality and talk us through how we've approached data security for CommCare. Fun fact, CommCare is the only, to our knowledge, SOC 2 certified global good, so we take security extremely seriously. And then lastly, we'll hear from Rishabh Rath, who helped write the Data Management and Security Playbook. He'll give a primer on the playbook and give you some really actionable tips on how to best use it to inform your work. We also want this to be interactive. There'll be a few polls along the way, and as we're talking, please drop questions into the Zoom Q&A feature. Our team will be here answering questions throughout the presentation, and if we've got a bit of time at the end, we may be able to answer a few questions live. You'll also get a recording of today's webinar afterwards, so you can look out for that. All right. So quickly, by way of introduction, if you aren't familiar with us, Dimagi is a global technology social enterprise working towards a world where everyone receives access to the services they need to thrive. Since 2002, Dimagi has built and scaled sustainable, high-impact digital solutions that amplify frontline workers and programs. We are most well known as the makers of CommCare, a digital platform that lets organizations like yours quickly and securely build custom applications for frontline data collection and program delivery. We've created an incredibly useful and practical guide to data management and security. If you haven't downloaded it already, I highly recommend doing so as a follow-on to what you'll learn today. And I will say this is not a piece of marketing collateral. This is a rich, heavily researched and reviewed playbook for getting secure data management right in global development. We'd like to thank Digital Square for previously advising on and funding the development of this playbook last year. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Erin Quinn, who works with dozens, perhaps hundreds of development organizations to take us through what changes she is seeing in the security landscape. Over to you, Erin.
Thanks so much, Amy, and thank you to all of you guys who are joining us from across the globe. We really appreciate you being here for this hour to talk about such an important topic. We're going to hear so much during the next hour about data security, but I really want to set the stage for today's discussion as we dive into this topic. We're talking today about data security, but I want to take one step back and talk about data and its importance to all of us. This is a quote from the Canadian First Nations Information Government Center, who's developed a set of data principles called OCAP. You can see it reads, "Today, one of our most important resources is information. Information isn't just about numbers and surveys, it's about culture, identity, traditions, and self-determination." As you can see here, they really emphasize how valuable and precious information and data is in today's world. And when we talk about data, I think we can often think of it as a really abstract concept of big data sets going through various systems and pipelines, and how are we getting it from one system to the other. But I want to ground our conversation today with the importance of data and its inherent value to the people from whom it comes and who it represents. And so with data that precious, of course, we want to protect it. And there's an ever-growing need to get better at protecting it. As Microsoft's 2024 Digital Defense Report reminds us, there's been an increase in both the number and sophistication of cybersecurity threats. Every day we see 600 million identity attacks. And some of the most targeted organizations are NGOs, governments, education, and research institutions. So a lot of institutions that probably represent the types of organizations that you guys are a part of. Particularly targeted are organizations that the Cyber Peace Institute classifies as cyber poor and target rich, which means that they have incredibly valuable sets of data, but relatively low or lax amounts of security. And again, sadly for us, a lot of global development organizations fall into this category. But we also see that our actions can make a really big difference. So the Microsoft Defense Report, they found that between 2023 and 2024, there was a 2.75 times increase in ransomware attacks. 92% of these that were successful entered the network via an unmanaged device. But interestingly, we see that while there was a steady increase in the number of attacks, there's actually a threefold decrease in the number of attacks that are successful or reach the encryption stage. This is largely due to the automated capabilities of cybersecurity software that many organizations have started using in response to the threat of ransomware attacks. And so while you could look at this slide and get really worried about the increase of attacks, what I really want you to take away from this and what I want to drive home here is that our response to security threats matters. And it really can make a big difference in ensuring that your organization's security posture is strong. And so really we have the ability to change our security posture and make sure that we do better protect ourselves. The best way to make a difference is not by adding on new security layers, but by ensuring that your regular data practices are secure. It's making sure that all the people who work at your organization day to day are aware of your security standards and are adhering to them. But as we all know, this can be really challenging, especially for social impact organizations who are often having to do more with even less resources. And so with that, we'd like to open this up to everyone on the line to give you guys a moment just to reflect. So thinking about your organization's regular data practices, what's your biggest question? Drop it into the Q&A and we'll be able to respond to you kind of throughout this presentation. And we'll also be able to take some of these at the end as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Erin. Now over to Clayton.
Thanks so much, Amy. Hi, everybody. My name is Clayton, and I'm Dimagi's Chief Technology Officer. Over the last couple decades of working in impact technology, I've had the chance to be responsible for data security practices for some small, scrappy teams, all the way up to some teams that were managing data systems with records that covered maybe 1 in 10 people on the planet. And since I think best practices for security change so quickly, I always think it's interesting to kind of reflect back on what we've learned and how we've adapted, both because technology changes really fast and because, as Erin was mentioning, our teams and our responsibilities have really grown in our industry, especially. And I think this topic is of unique importance to us in impact technology. Right. I mean, the reason that we're all fundamentally here is to improve lives. And I think digital systems are uniquely able to increase our ability to scale, not just our positive impact, but also the potential harm we can do. By consolidating data, we're increasing its value to bad actors. By making it easier for our key stakeholders to access, we're also making it easier for attackers to get to it. So I think it's incredibly important for us to be mindful of what scales of data we're equipped to handle responsibly, right? Protecting data is really essential for protecting people. And sometimes the only winning move in a security game is not to play. So we need to consider whether the cost of protecting data is sufficiently worth it to, for the impact that we're hoping to generate from it. And one thing I think you might be heartened to know is that regardless of size or budget, almost every organization feels like they're facing challenges having enough resources for security, even if that challenge does happen to be doubly true for our sector, being focused on impact over profit or other goals. But, I think being intentional about how to prioritize security is important to be able to leverage our time and our capacity. And to me, these 4 principles are at the core of an effective approach to being a responsible custodian of sensitive data. And that's being mindful of our footprint, preventing the most common attack vectors, practicing user-centered security, and making sure we're handling data safely. And I'll talk a little bit about what I mean in each of these areas and how organizations can incorporate them into their approach. I think the most important starting point for organizations is to really plan structurally for what full breadth of digital infrastructure that they can really be accountable for in an ongoing way. The biggest vulnerability for organizations that have grown from small to large, it isn't necessarily the vulnerability or the security in a new digital system for their new scale. It's often the security of like a legacy system sitting next to it that hasn't been patched in 3 years, and after being compromised is just one network hop away. Security is almost always a weakest link problem. In practical evidence-backed terms, these kind of side channel vulnerabilities have been involved in a number of the most significant breaches in our industry specifically. But I think they're also among the most preventable, right? When considering choices for new digital infrastructure, organizations should really be looking to establish not just the base costs, but a holistic cost of what adoption and maintenance of that system is going to take long-term and as it scales up. Because if the personnel and security and capacity required for any maintenance and modernization and monitoring, if they're not considered and kind of spent upfront in like a long-term budget, they're most likely to start arising just when systems start to scale. And I think that's often the hardest time to change course, which is what creates that really, really dangerous situation. And to know what capabilities are important to cover at those costs, it's important to remain focused on the most critical threat models and the current evidence-based best practices for how we mitigate them. Because on a day-to-day basis, most security is still really, really, really boring, right? Almost half of all data breaches, they're still not coming from encryption or hard failures. They're coming from account takeovers. Most system compromises, they're not these esoteric zero-day hacking situations. They're unpatched vulnerabilities that sit on servers for years before some bot finally runs across them when it's looking across the internet for an easy picking. So in deciding what's necessary to control for these risks, it can be intimidating to keep up with what feels maybe like a constantly changing landscape. But knowing more about what works, I think, can reduce the amount of capacity that requires for us to implement it. And I'll give you one example that's based on one of the key resources that our team relies on, which is NIST Security and Privacy Control Schedule that's published by the National Institute for Standards and Technology. To mitigate the account takeover threat model I was talking about earlier, the most recent NIST guidance actively advises against the legacy onerous kind of security theater practices that you might associate with high security environments. Things like rotating passwords every 3 months or insisting that everyone's password has like exactly 2 ampersands and all these really specific things. The evidence-based models say those don't work, right? Based on a review of real world evidence and attacks and what's prevented them, the current guidance is actually just to let users choose their own password and to use correctly configured multi-factor authentication. One thing that's continued to appear over and over in evidence-based practices over time is that underneath all the complexity of digital security, the vast majority of real security failings don't come from some unknown technical failure. They come from human error. So the image that pops into your head here is probably something like phishing, and that's a really, really, really valid concern, and it's only going to get more real over the next 2 or 3 years. I get fake SMSs from our CEO or a very generous bank that's offering Dimagi a loan or something nearly once a week at this point. Making sure that everyone in your organization is engaged and understanding security risks is more important than ever, as are finding ways that you can make sure that they're really being put into practice. Things like sending fake phishing emails to see whether your team can spot them. But considering human factors effectively in security, it's also about the usability of your security posture. And by that, I mean making sure that people can actually practice the policies that they won't need to, and that they're supported to do so. When I reflect back on all the things that we've done in security as an organization in the last decade, I wouldn't be surprised if the single most effective one was just investing in an enterprise security password manager. Right? Before it was possible for our team to use highly technical tools to safely manage logins, but now it's actually easier for them to use our password manager than it is for them to do anything else. And I think for technical teams, this principle speaks to how important it is to have realistic expectations for what your team can really accomplish and whether you're really prioritizing it as an organization. It's easy to say, that audits are done for all the users with administrative privileges in your system. It's another for a team member to really believe that that's their top priority on a week when there's an unrelated external deadline. Independent security audits like ISO or SOC 2, I think this is why they're so effective and important, keeping teams honest on whether it's actually possible for them to meet their stated security policies and practices, being confident in what it costs to do so. And then, of course, after all that comes the underlying handling of sensitive data, how it can be secured through encryption and safely shared through processes like anonymization. And this is the big part of security that's directly related to the capacities of the tools that you choose to adopt, and not just how you manage them. A lot of digital tools still focus on the really hard controls, advertising like their military grade quantum encryption, stuff like that. But I think it's a really big mistake to make those the biggest factors in decision making. Because to be totally honest, as a tech person, they're really the easiest part of security technology these days. Rather, I think it's more the practical things like, can I safely share sensitive data through this system with someone and be confident that they won't be able to see it after they don't need it anymore? Or can I audit everyone who's added new administrators to our system? Those are the things that are increasingly important as organizations scale and mature, since people can't lose what they don't have. And the nuances of those practical needs highlight a really common challenge across all of these pillars, which is keeping ourselves accountable for how we assess and follow through on them. And I want to hand things over to our Director of Technology, Kai, to talk about the approach and challenges of implementing them at scale with Dimagi's flagship global good, CommCare.
Thank you, Clayton. So we've spent quite a bit of time so far discussing concepts about security, more at the 30,000 foot level. So I want to bring it way down to earth, and I want to talk about what we are doing at Dimagi day in, day out to live up to some of these principles that we've shared in this presentation and give you something to take away and share about other organizations and what they're doing for their security. So I want to start by just talking about our tool. So our open source digital tools are global good. So what that means is that we've built it in a way where it is applicable to different countries, different contexts, to address all sorts of key systemic challenges around the world. The goal is to cut down on fragmentation and duplication of digital tools so that we can accelerate scale and impact across the world. What that means, however, is that the data security and compliance on our team, it's incredibly important to have a wide array of different sorts of certifications and different standards to meet the needs of our partners across the world. So that means HIPAA compliance, GDPR, SOC 2, Privacy Shield. These are all terms that I'm sure many of you on this call have heard one, maybe all of these different frameworks and certifications. And so we've taken an intentional effort to ensure that we meet those needs. And to give you a sense of sort of what that takes at Dimagi, we have to maintain a dedicated team of engineers, engineering managers, and other folks, operations staff, who are watching all of our platform services and looking out for necessary updates and respond immediately to vulnerabilities. So as Clayton discussed earlier, there are those layers of different services that tools like us use, and we have to stay on top of those dependencies and make sure that they're updated. We also have a dedicated team accountable for running reviews of our security controls across the organization. So this is on a monthly, quarterly, and annual basis, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in my next section. And then finally, we perform audits and penetration testing. Some of you on this call may have asked us for that information in the past, and we use an independent third-party firm to ensure we stay up on these certifications. And as Amy shared at the beginning, we are, to our knowledge, the only global good that has a SOC 2 Type 2 certification. So knowing that, I would like to pivot the conversation a little bit and talk about what it was like to receive SOC 2 certification and also what it's like to maintain that certification over time. So SOC 2 is an auditing standard that many of you might be aware of, and it essentially assesses an organization's ability to adhere to trust services criteria around security, availability, confidentiality, privacy of data, and this is across the organization. So essentially, it ensures that a service provider like ours securely manages data to protect the privacy of ourselves at the organization, but also of our partners that we work with. So Dimagi received Type 1 certification in 2021. So 2020 actually was the year we embarked on this long journey to get the Type 1 certification, which essentially shows that you were able to meet the criteria over 1 full year. And then we received Type 2 certification in 2022, which essentially measures how well you're able to meet the trust services criteria on a recurring basis over time, year after year after year. And so now that we're in 2025, we still maintain that certification. What goes into maintaining this is no small feat. So we have engineers on staff doing the technical implementation. So as you all know, obviously, to maintain SOC 2, there are technical controls, a lot of the things that Clayton touched on around how our software is built to ensure there's no vulnerabilities in place. However, it's the continuous monitoring piece of when new users, when new administrators at Dimagi are added to the platform, when new staff are added to Dimagi as a whole. It's that part that requires a lot of continuous monitoring and checking in terms of roles and permissions. And the good thing, but also the bad thing about cybersecurity is that it continually evolves. So as we learn more and more over time about how to be more secure, it also means that our controls have to change along with them. And these changes have to happen at the human level for it to really matter. And it means our behaviors and our habits have to change. And that's the part that's been the most challenging for organizations attempting to achieve the SOC 2 certification. So this means you have to put people at the center. So this means you have to ensure that your support team is following certain processes around, user provisioning, and then you have to make sure, we're following up on annual trainings of staff. Those are the types of things where people need to be at the center. And to ensure that we're doing all that we can to prove our strong security stance here, we also undergo the rigorous penetration testing and auditing process that I had spoken about earlier. And this takes place near the end of the year, and it takes place over 4 to 6 months. It's quite a long process to do this with an independent security firm, and it touches wide different ranges from our operations team to our technical staff to our platform as a whole. And during that time, we review all of our controls, dozens of them, and we have to provide evidence for every single one. So if we say we do something in our SOC 2 report, you know that that means we have provided evidence physically showing that we are performing that action over the course of the year. All of this we have found is worth it, despite the time and despite the costs. And it's because this is the way that we live up to our values that we shared here as a company. And as Clayton mentioned, to protect data means to protect the people within our platform. So at this time, I'll hand it over to Rishabh, who's going to talk through the security playbook itself and give you some of the tools and the insights you need to implement a strong security standard at your organization.
Thanks, Guy. Hi, everyone. I'm Rishabh. I'm the Director of Sales Engineering at Dimagi. In the next few slides, we'll walk through what this playbook is all about. For many organizations, especially smaller ones, data security can feel like an unfamiliar and overwhelming concept. But when you think of it not as a standalone challenge, but as something integrated into each stage of the data lifecycle, it becomes much more accessible and easier to understand. This approach helps break it down into clear, actionable steps tied to what you're already doing, making it less daunting and more practical. While data security is a top priority, it doesn't have to feel overwhelming or out of reach for organizations. Depending on an organization's size and resources, the data security goals can and should be tailored to what is reasonable and achievable for them. For example, a small community health program may not have anyone on their team with the required technical expertise and face issues related to budget constraints and data management. Their goal may be to simply establish secure data collection practices complying with basic regulations. This may feel different for a regional NGO that is managing increased data volumes while ensuring that data needs to be accurate. They may be more focused on advanced data management practices and have greater data security requirements for their complex workflows. At the far end of this spectrum, If we think of INGOs, they may face extensive data sets and have the most robust enterprise data security requirements across tens of systems. Keeping that premise in mind, we've designed a practical and accessible guide to help social impact organizations securely manage their data with practical and affordable guidance. Our security partner, Crux, did a third-party security review of the playbook as well. We adapted the widely known data lifecycle framework from Harvard Business School for our playbook. The playbook defines the 4 stages of the data lifecycle: generation and collection of data, processing of data, storage and management, and finally, analysis, visualization, and interpretation. We then align these stages with 3 distinct data maturity levels for organizations. These include foundational, intermediate, and advanced. The framework empowers organizations to assess where they currently stand in their data management journey and develop practical, tailored security plans that meet their unique needs. By breaking the process into clear, actionable steps, the playbook ensures that organizations of any size or capacity can implement achievable data security measures while planning for future growth and increased complexity. Let's now zoom into the stages to understand what this really means for organizations across the data maturity spectrum. Here, we'll focus on the data collection stage. A local NGO at the foundational level of data maturity would need basic form building with simple role-based access for data collection. A regional NGO or INGO headquarters, on the other hand, would require more complex tracking of workflows and data management. Let's look at what this actually means at each level of data maturity. Let's focus on the secure data collection considerations for a local NGO at the foundational level of data maturity. A typical example would be a small community health program with a team of, say, 5 to 10 members, setting up their first digital solution for collecting health data. Now, what are the challenges this team might face? These could be limited technical expertise and budget constraints, for example. And what would the goal be for this NGO? To establish basic data collection with simple role-based access, ensuring compliance with basic regulations. What's the ideal setup in a scenario like this? The team would build an efficient data model on data collection tools that allow for mapping key indicators, creating linkage between data collected. Intuitive form building tools are helpful in setting up such models. The solution should aim to be user-friendly and work in low resource and offline settings for targeting the most vulnerable populations. Data should be collected on both mobile and web applications and stored on local devices until synced to the server. This is where security controls, like secure data transmission, think of HTTPS and encryption, for example, and role-based access can be implemented. This helps in protecting sensitive information by allowing only authorized personnel to access or modify data, thereby maintaining data integrity and confidentiality. Let's now look at a regional NGO at the intermediate level of data maturity. This could be a team of 20 to 50 people working on more than one thematic area. While expanding operations, they need to handle more complex data. What challenges would they face? They'd be required to manage increased data volume, ensuring data accuracy while maintaining compliance. What's their end goal? Implementing secure, advanced data management practices while supporting complex workflows. An ideal setup in this scenario, along with an intuitive form builder, would involve advanced logic and calculations in their solutions, along with multiple language support where needed. In larger deployments, different users might be collecting data for the same set of clients. This requires user and data hierarchies to be built into the system. In order to manage data collection effectively, using metadata and data cataloging techniques would be needed to maintain data hygiene and coherence as they scale. Along with mobile and web applications to collect data, organizations at this level may require bulk data upload options as well. No-code solutions with in-product options like Excel uploads for bulk data would be best suited for such organizations. Finally, let's look at an international NGO at an advanced level of data maturity. This could be an international organization with over 100 members managing large-scale deployments across geographies with a robust tech stack. Their challenges would include working with multiple systems and extensive data sets, which requires ensuring robust data security and coherence between the systems. Their goal would be to utilize advanced data tools, comprehensive security measures like multi-factor authentication, single sign-on, and regular audit controls. What's the ideal setup in a scenario like this? Organizations at this stage need advanced data collection platforms capable of building complex models and tracking relationships across entities over time. A robust release management system is essential for deploying standardized solutions, such as template applications for tracking global indicators, perhaps, enabling consistent and structured data collection across teams. Data processes become multi-layered, requiring case management and hierarchical data sharing to ensure only authorized stakeholders access relevant information via role-based controls. Security practices like multi-factor authentication, single sign-on, and regular security audits become critical at this stage. Additionally, APIs streamline bulk data collection from multiple sources, while ongoing staff trainings helps maintain security standards. I hope these examples have been useful for everyone. With that, I'll hand it back to Amy.
Thank you so much, Rishabh. Really appreciate that. So let's take a moment for a couple of polls, and then we will head into Q&A. So Sarah's going to go ahead and launch the polls for us. All right. So as folks are answering those polls, we've got a bit of time, so we can do a bit of Q&A. We've got some good questions. We've answered them in the chat, but maybe it's worth going through them live as well. All right. So let's see. I'm going to take these one by one. Let's see. The first question we had was around automated tools for cybersecurity. This was from Herbert. And Herbert, if you had any follow-ups to this question, feel free to pop them into the chat. But I'm going to ask Clayton to share a little bit about this.
Absolutely. Thanks, Amy. Yeah, so I think this is a really good question. Erin mentioned this a little bit earlier, but I think one of the big things that has made the current kind of internet security posture viable in this world of automated attacks is a stronger posture in automated defense. So we actually use a number of automation tools internally at Dimagi, and we see a lot of that in our partners as well. My experience with a lot of these tools is that in order for them to work effectively, they really need to have their own large data sets to work with. So, we rely a lot on the automated security posture from our cloud tools through AWS, or I mentioned Sentinel for people who are in Azure environments. But honestly, I think the biggest kind of input source of automation that we've benefited from over the last couple of years are what people kind of refer to as control tower events, which are a type of automation that come more through your enterprise data management tools. So if you use Google Workspace, if you use Microsoft 365, tools like this can be configured to provide administrators alerts about how your employees and how your systems are being managed at scale. And the more data that we centralize into these systems with really strong capabilities, the more that you're able to kind of benefit from those. We actually, I mentioned the Enterprise Password Manager earlier. That's one of those ones too, where we actually get a lot of really good information organization-wide about how people are using passwords and logins and how they're using those tools. So I think really just leveraging the automated alerts and the automated reporting that come from existing tools can be its own really strong starting point before digging into any sort of need for more complex or more sophisticated automation tools. Thanks, Amy.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Clayton. And if folks have follow-up questions to that, feel free to pop them either into the chat or the Q&A. Yeah, the next question we had was from Susan, who's asking about data governance in a multi-sector program, which is such a great question. And I'm going to hand that one to Erin to speak to.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And it's something that we see a lot of our partners grappling with, especially as we see the rise of these really, really large multi-sector programs getting funded more and more. So the main thing to focus on when we're talking about a multi-sector program, we're talking about like a project that does a whole bunch of different things. So I think the example I gave in the answer was you might have a project that's working with refugee populations, and maybe they have a mental health component, they have like an OPD or clinic component, a legal component, and an education component. And really, you could almost consider like each arm of that program as its own kind of mini project, but they all serve the same set of clients. And so we do want to make sure that, you know, this is all part of the same system. We want to track that all together. But at the same time, there's no reason that someone in the education wing of this program needs to know anything about what the clinic is doing or what the mental health counselors are doing. And in fact, we really want to segment that data out. It's inappropriate for someone in the education wing to be viewing data like that. And so that I think is one of the biggest things that I see when we're working with multi-sector programs is this idea and this requirement that we need everyone to see some of the data. Like if I'm working with, this refugee population, I need to know that Amy Vaccaro is a client that all of my programs could work with. But I don't want anyone in different programs to actually be able to dig into that data. So the biggest thing here is to make sure that you select a tool that can segment this data and that supports user-based, like role-based permissioning. And so what we mean when we say that is, can you create custom roles in your system where you are able to define what people are able to see when they log into the system? So if you guys have worked with CommCare before, you've probably set up like custom web user roles, or maybe you've set up within your application, you've used user properties where you've like hidden forms or modules. But basically you can create different views so that when you log into the application, one user, like a mental health counselor, sees one whole set of data, and an education program worker sees an entirely different set of data. But that really all happens only if you have a system that can support roles-based permissioning. And it takes a lot of really intentional work at that very first design phase to make sure that, of course, not only are you selecting the right tool that can support that, but also that you're designing your system in a way that the data is going to be shareable in all the right ways, so that we all kind of understand that we have that same access to the client list, but also that we're segmenting the data out. So it's really making sure you select the right tool and making sure that you're spending a lot of time in that design phase supporting a data structure that is going to make this possible for your system.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Erin. And Susan, if you're still on and have follow-up questions, feel free to pop them into the chat. And folks, as you're listening, if other questions come up, feel free to put them in the chat as well. Next, we are going to go to a question from Chad, which is, does uploading and syncing data from CommCare over unsecured public internet pose a risk to our data? And I'm going to hand that to Kai first and then to Clayton to add to that.
Yeah, so I think the most important thing to stress here is that your data is for sure safe within our systems. I think it's the best practice here around using unsecured networks is more of a security principle that I wanted to respond to in this question that I think it's important for everyone to maintain. I make this mistake myself all the time when using unsecured networks on airports and cafes and things like that, to be super careful about logging into my bank account or other secured networks and making sure I'm not doing that. Because there are a lot of vulnerabilities with unsecured networks like that. And you want to make sure if you're doing anything that involves, personally identifiable information and things like that, that you're using a secured, password secured network that you can rely on and you can trust, especially those at your organization. I'll pass it over to Clayton to add a little bit more detail if you'd like.
Yeah, thanks, Kai. I think it is a really good question. There's always a tension between kind of the best answer and an okay answer, and I think this is one of those ones where the nuance to these kind of questions is that in practical terms, for the most part, it is physically safe for correctly configured device on a correctly configured public network to transmit data. And through HTTPS encryption, it is actually technically safe to send that data through an unsecured network, right? The HTTP connection makes it so that your computer and that upstream server are able to communicate safely, regardless of the security of the intermediate network. But that's the best case scenario, right? What can happen on an unsecured network is often some set of other things, right? So if you're on an unsecured network, other devices on the network have access to your device. So if your device isn't up to date or is unpatched, other devices may be able to get access to it through an attack on that side. Or if you're on the network and your users receive what's called an intermediate man-in-the-middle attack, where someone's pretending to be your server, they won't be able to submit data by default, but they can click 2 or 3 buttons on the phone and then allow themselves to unsecurely submit data because someone has tricked them into thinking that they have to do those things to get the data up to the server. So it's not that it's necessarily insecure to do so, but it opens the door to 1 or 2 of these other ways that data can leave the secure network. So I think that kind of speaks to the notion of, layering things. So if you had a secure network, you're adding a layer of security where those side channel attacks aren't possible. And that kind of security layering and posturing is something you want to do more and more and more of as there's more data to scale and as there's more sensitive data that your programs are managing. So it's less of a one-size-fits-all answer and a little bit more of something to keep in mind and to grow as your organization has more access to more data and is kind of responsible for a larger surface area.
Thanks so much, Clayton and Kai. And to Chad, I see you're on still. If you have follow-up questions, feel free to pop them into the chat. Next question is from George. And his question is, cross-border data sharing remains a big challenge. And for this one, I'm going to hand it back to Clayton to respond.
Thanks, Amy. Yeah, I think this has definitely come through in so much of our work. To be honest, this kind of challenge of not just securing data within your system when it never leaves, but the challenges of being able to get data out of our systems into another system in a secure way. When you have 2 different data systems that speak in different terms and are secured in different formats, that's often where a lot of these breakdowns occur. We manage all of our data safely, but as soon as we face the challenge of needing to work with this really complex intercompatibility, we end up losing access to the ways that we formulated data. And kind of as I mentioned in my response here, I really do think that the most effective ways that we've seen organizations be able to share data, not just in terms of security, but in terms of effectiveness, is often to get data out of a private or a sensitive context, right? Anonymized data sets or being able to share aggregated data or reporting or getting just, again, the individually identifiable pieces out of data when we move them, I think really adds a lot of value. And I do think the clearinghouses we've seen within national governments or within regional governments to be doing data sharing of non-sensitive data, I think often gets a lot of use. We actually see a lot of open data programming being really effective right now with clearinghouses for things like mapping information, things like building sites to help with microplanning and communities. That kind of open data set has this really big advantage that it can be shared and remixed. So, I think, again, I said this a little bit when we were talking earlier, but, the safest sensitive data is no sensitive data. So, getting data synthesized, getting data into formats where it can be openly shared without needing to be secured, I think is really one of the bigger focuses we've seen over time as organizations scale and mature. And I'm really excited to see that be more of a focus.
And if I can just add to that answer too, I think I went to the NetHope Summit this past October, and we talked a lot about data sharing there as well. And I think when we talk about data sharing, either within the context of like cross-border or in large consortia, when I think about it, there's really 2 issues. One is like this political and like partnership issue, and then one is like the actual technical data portion of it. I think everything Clayton just talked about is that second, like actually, like how do you get the data to talk to each other? There's a huge portion of this that is complicated because we as organizations have to agree that we want to share our data, and we have to get our governments on board with that and all of that. And I think actually like a lot of times what the technologists in the room at NetHope were expressing was that like everyone on the ground that's working on the project agrees we need to share this data, and they could figure out a way to do that technically. And it's actually like the agreement portion that they're not able to get through. So one of the things that they were really suggesting was that we start talking about and drafting data sharing agreements at the RFP stage, like literally at the inception of the project, start getting everyone in a big consortium on board with the idea that we're going to be sharing data in this project. We across whatever the data sharing agreement is going to look like. But the idea that a lot of what we're currently having trouble with when we talk about data sharing is more because we can't actually agree, we can't contract this well enough, and less because we don't actually have the interoperability to make this work. So I think when we talk about data sharing, I want to be really clear that there are like two really distinct sets of issues here, and one is technical and one is human and contractual, and you need to solve both to make sure that data sharing happens.
Thanks so much, Erin and Clayton. And I'm seeing some questions also in the chat. We're going to try to get through all of them. If you have the capability, it's great to add the question into the Q&A feature. That way we can type out a response and also respond live, and everyone can kind of see the response. But we'll try to get through all of them. So the next question is from Jibo, which is about, is it possible to install and configure CommCare on a local server? And I'll hand that to Clayton.
Yeah, I mean, this is an easy, quick one. Yeah, I posted a link in the Q&A if anybody else is interested to a couple resources there about hosting options and to the documentation for your technical teams if they're looking to set up their own CommCare server. But the high-level answer very much is yes, you can set up and install CommCare locally onto an individual server using the cloud configuration tools that we use internally at Dimagi. Those are public and available and for use for any other users, both on on-premise clouds or on-premise environments, or if you want to run them in the cloud. And it is very much possible to migrate your SaaS data onto a local environment. So you can always get started in the cloud, set up your spaces, set up your data sharing, get everything running, and then move to a local environment once that's prepared. Thanks, Amy.
Awesome. Thank you.
One thing, just because this
yeah.
is the data security webinar that I will point out though, if you decide to locally host, you also have to be the one that protects that local instance of CommCare. You know, CommCare that is cloud hosted comes with all, you know, HIPAA compliance, GDPR compliance, SOC 2 Type 2, all of that. If you locally host, it is now your responsibility to keep that safe. So that is kind of one of the big benefits of going with our cloud hosted option. And that's certainly why a lot of people start off on our cloud hosted option.
Awesome. Thanks, Erin. We're going to keep going through questions, but if folks need to drop, feel free to as well. This is but really, really rich conversation here. The next question is from Thomas. It looks like you put it in the Q&A and the chat, which is, I'd like to have a good notion of protecting the data of a library in the African region from piracy. What are the necessary security measures with the AI? Anyone want to raise their hand to respond to this one?
Yeah, sure. I can probably jump on a little bit on that one. I mean, it's a pretty big surface area, so it's pretty challenging to give a one size fits all answer. I mean, I think my answer to almost all of these questions, the 10,000 view, is to just have as few moving parts as possible, and to make sure that you have a plan to keep things up to date. I mean, I think one thing that we see over and over and over is having like out-of-date servers, out-of-date networking equipment in your environments, things like that. So, exposing as little data as possible outside to the internet is a big part of that. If you don't have to expose anything publicly to the internet in the first place, then I think it's easy not to lose that data. And then otherwise, trying to make sure that you're taking advantage of the most up-to-date systems you can. I think there's a lot of great data sharing tools right now. I think a lot of organizations, as I mentioned earlier, are able to use really secure cloud tools for this kind of data storage. Things like Google Workspace can be huge capacity stores of data. They're up to date. They're managed by extremely expensive engineers that none of us have access to. So, the top line answer is put data into the cloud in someone else's hands. But if you have to host it locally, I mean, I think really it's just nuts and bolts stuff. Set up everything locally, make sure you have a plan to keep it up to date, and use the most modern, maintained software that you can to do it.
Thanks so much. And Thomas, we'd be happy to talk further too. It sounds like it could be a richer conversation there. All right. Trying to figure out which questions to answer next. There's one in the chat from Ogden, which is, can you definitively delete data on the CommCare platform? Can you do this using the APIs?
Hi, yeah, I can answer that pretty concretely, and Kai can probably jump in on what some of the current user-facing capabilities are here. So we definitely do have the ability to delete data off of our servers. We do have audited compliance that confirms that we use appropriate techniques to fully destroy data once we close out project spaces and once data leaves the environment. The specificity of how much data you can delete through the APIs varies a little bit. I'm going to hand over to to answer which specific things you can control on your end, other than asking for a full data deletion from the team.
Yeah, that's right. So you can, I've sent a chat here where you can kind of look at some of our data removal techniques for forms and cases. So as Clayton said, written inside of our wiki there, you can find steps on how to delete things, and when things are deleted, they're deleted for sure. So we can definitely confirm that. When it comes to the APIs, it's actually a great timely question for us this year. So this is a product area that we've been investing in, specifically our APIs over the past year, and data deletion has been coming up over and over. And so this is a place where we'll be exploring sort of that feature. And we do a lot of partner engagement when it comes to our product feature improvements. So I may reach out to you, Ogden, for just a little bit of user feedback as we think about building a data deletion API. So yeah, thanks for giving us that insight.
Awesome. Question from Demisu in the chat. What are the thoughts to integrate and leverage the benefits of generative AI into the platform? And I assume you mean CommCare as the platform. This is a great question. Who would like to speak to this one?
Sure, I can jump in and answer a little bit of that. So from a security perspective, I think we're actually seeing a lot of these benefits already in a lot of our cloud environments and in a lot of the kind of mature availability from those services that I mentioned earlier. A lot of those automation systems and a lot of those pieces are already kind of incorporating the best practices from those sets of models. I think we're definitely excited, as all organizations are, to incorporate more generative AI in facilitating people using things more efficiently, kind of giving people better cues for how to use what features are available and how to engage with them and how to learn from them. It definitely does open up, I think, as a lot of people have kind of noted, some of these security challenges. In the sense that generative AI makes it very easy to create capabilities without fully knowing their scope and their span. We see that a lot with code. That's a big concern from our team. We're using a lot of generative AI actually right now to help our team with things like code review and to help our teams with things on the development end, while having to keep in mind kind of this fundamental view that generative AI makes it very easy to create things you don't understand. So that tension's been a little bit of a risk reward balance that we're jumping into. I think it's excited to see where we will go.
Cool. And I'll also add a link in the chat to OpenChat Studio, which is a generative AI platform that our team is building. Separate team, not necessarily the team on this call, but another Dimagi offering where we're really looking into how can we leverage large language models to create chatbots to create value in the use cases that CommCare is used in around the world. Question from Aisha. How can we integrate with USSD with CommCare so the data collected through USSD can appear in CommCare as a case list? This seems like a good Erin question.
Yeah, so I think I'm not exactly certain what you mean by USSD, but if you are talking about a system that you want to integrate in terms of actually collecting data on a different system and then sending it to CommCare, you have a few different options. Sometimes you can always use our APIs to link any data from any other system and send it, forward it along to create cases in CommCare and then continuously update them. That's certainly a workflow that we've seen on some of our larger, more sophisticated projects. There are also workflows that we've seen where people will kind of be transitioning over from a different system into CommCare, and they will actually kind of do like a bulk download of their data and then upload it using our tools like the Excel case importer to kind of get all of their cases established within CommCare. But then they're really kind of operating almost entirely within the CommCare world. So that is kind of them mostly working within CommCare then and using CommCare as the primary tool. But essentially, either of those ways, either using APIs or uploading your cases via the Excel case importer, will then allow any data that you have to appear in CommCare, create cases there, and then allow you to access all of those cases in your case list and be able to kind of go about as if someone had registered those in your application, and you can access those and go about your regular workflows with those cases.
Yeah, just add a little more detail on that. We have we do have partners who use USSD as part of their workflows. I think one thing that we've definitely encountered over and over with USSD is that the context of every USSD implementation tends to be very specific to carriers. It tends to be very specific to the context of the programs you're running. So it's very hard to scale. We actually generally use a couple different API pieces of our API layer to facilitate those USSD systems. So we have them running at scale in a couple countries, both through organizations who've implemented the USSD pass-through on the server side. So they receive USSD messages and then they create messages, they create cases through CommCare's APIs. And then on local devices where organizations have implemented standalone small applications that receive the USSD in the regional context and then transmit it to the CommCare application through on-device information sharing. So we've seen that happen in both ways. I think there's a couple of write-ups online that we may share or point out to on how organizations have done that. But I think that's an extensibility. We see that as kind of an extensibility piece that we try to get organizations to use those API layers to adopt. And we've seen orgs have a lot of success in keeping up just that one small part of the system.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We've got just about 3 minutes left, so maybe one, possibly two questions. One question that has come in, exporting from CommCare to Excel and work on the data, would that pose any risk to the raw captured data? And I'm going to hand this one to Erin.
Yeah, that's a great question. And we've been actually talking more and more about this. For any of you guys who are working on CommCare, I'm sure that you guys are used to working with our Excel case importer, which is a great way of bulk editing your case data and then being able to, re-upload it. It does not pose any threat to the raw data that lives on the server in terms of if you're taking stuff, you're editing it in Excel. It's not like Excel is actively talking to the server and changing anything. The biggest risk, though, that I think Kai might have talked about either in the chat or in a different question, is remember that now you have an Excel file with potentially really sensitive data in it, right? And so you are going to want to be really cognizant of treating that Excel file in accordance with whatever your organization's best practices are. I do know that some of our partners recently have made policies saying that no client data should ever be in Excel. So they actually basically cannot use the Excel case importer anymore. At a minimum, we would think that after you take that export, you do your edits, you re-import it, I would think you should delete that off of your local device. Remember that CommCare will always store a version of that file securely in our system, so you don't need to be keeping that for your records. But really, the vulnerability there is the Excel file. It's not that whatever you have done in Excel is necessarily going to be like asynchronously somehow changing whatever's on the web. Nothing gets changed until you re-upload that to the server. I think the vulnerability there is now that you have some potentially sensitive data that lives on an Excel file on a local device somewhere, and you need to make sure that you're treating that in accordance with your organization's data standards or like data security best practices. Clayton, I don't know if you want to add anything else onto that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that sounds sounds totally right to me. I think kind of as I mentioned earlier, to me, this is one of those layered approach things. If you have a small amount of data in the organization and a small number of people who are supposed to be safely executing those kind of steps, download the data, manipulate it, upload it, delete it. I think that cycle is totally safe. There's nothing in particular that's wrong with it. It's as the organizations get larger that being able to do those actions safely start to become a little bit more challenging. And it starts to be a little bit more of a question of how you're enabling your teams to be able to do that safely and reliably, making sure that they're able to delete things. We're always trying, and one of the big focuses that we're pushing to on our kind of enterprise management of the systems these days is trying to provide more opportunities to do those bulk actions within the toolchain so that organizations don't need to have that kind of export, import, or local data management lifecycle. So that is a big focus for us as we're growing and as we're helping organizations to scale to try to minimize that surface area. And I think that's something that we see in organizations' policies too.
Awesome. I think we've actually pretty much answered most of the questions. I do see one last question from Lagese, which is, what best practices would you advise for getting rid of client data from CommCare after a project ends? And maybe Clayton, if you want to do like a 30-second on that, and then we'll close out.
Sure. Thanks, Amy. Yeah, I think this is a really, 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 really good question. And I think it's something that a lot of organizations and a lot of projects consider too late in the life cycle. Because when you start, if you have a clear retention policy, you have a clear policy of we're going to collect this data for this period of time, and then we're going to close everything out. It's easy then later to execute on that. Once a project started, once people start to get reliant on it, it's a little bit trickier then to decide exactly when and how to be retaining data. So I think one easy answer is it's really helpful to think of this up front. What is the long-term plan for this data going to be? Is this an operational system that's going to run forever? Is this a system that is going to have a sliding window of how much data is going to get managed? Or is the system that has a start point and an end point? And once it's done, you're going to close things out. I think it's good for organizations to plan on start, end point, close things out as being the default assumptive path for how we're managing data, or that long-term path. We're going to be doing this forever. We know we're going to need to secure this data forever, and we kind of need to manage it. I think CommCare makes both those options possible. It's possible for you to keep the data in the system securely if you need to pause temporarily and return back to it, which is a good option. And that's something that we've seen organizations take advantage of, so that when there are gaps in kind of that processing, that they can still have secure options for that archival and removal. But ultimately, I think the big point there is to think of the data lifecycle in advance, and then you can reach out if you have any questions about what tools and capabilities that are made available to manage those life cycles.
Awesome. All right, with that, we will wrap. Thank you so much to all of our presenters today and to everyone for joining and for your incredible, thoughtful questions. I can tell this is just such an important issue and conversation. If there are questions that came out of this conversation that we didn't get to answer, especially around CommCare specifically, that were coming up towards the end, feel free to write to us. Our support team is here to help you if you're an existing CommCare user, or write to info@ with more general CommCare questions. We're super happy to partner with you to take your practices forward. And I'll close with just a quick plug on our podcast, which is a great channel to hear more insights and more conversations about all of these issues, as well as AI. It's co-hosted by our CEO, Jonathan Jackson. And you'll be getting a follow-up email from us with the recording and various materials from today's presentation. So thank you so much for spending an hour with us, and take care.